Hey everybody. All right, let's try this again. So we had a little bit of a technical glitch going live today, and I apologize for all of that. It's a sign of how out of practice I am after 5 days off. Many of you know that I did this quick 4 day run back and forth to the East Coast. I'm still like wildly jet lagged. My kids have been awake at 4:30 in the morning, so I apologize. I actually, when I was plugging this into Patreon this morning, plugged in tomorrow's date instead of today's. So my bad. I'm very sorry to all of you that we're running a few minutes late. You all know that since we moved over to Patreon, this doesn't happen very often. But anyway, we're back. So I hope all of you had a wonderful Thanksgiving with your families. I hope that everything went according to plan for all of you. And we have a lot of questions for today heading into this particular week. And, I want to start just by saying one of my usual words of warning, which it feels very important to say today, which is this. It's really critical at this particular moment in time, given that we are heading into a week where judiciary is going to take up impeachment, more on that in a second, and where we're likely to find ourselves in a place where there's going to be a lot of rabid commentary on Twitter and on the television, and pundits going off in one direction or another and having their own versions of how this is all impacting the American public. It's really important, and this is why I'm starting at this place today. It's really important that you remember that that your sources matter, and that everything that you are reading and watching, if it's reliably sourced, is still only the opinion of one person. And we had a lot of questions today on the feed where, my response to it was like, where are you getting that from? Which happens sometimes when we're kind of at a breaking point, right? Where when we're entering into a new phase of impeachment, we're entering into a new edge of where we're headed, where everybody who's trying to seek out information to understand what's likely to happen next is seeking out information. Sometimes that's not necessarily from reliable sources, or really even from people who have any idea what they're talking about. So please, as we head into this really important week of impeachment, make sure that you are not sharing information that comes from unreliable sources, that if you are reading one person's opinion on Twitter, you know that they're reliable and they know what they're talking about. And that, you're very careful about how you share that, because I'm just going to repeat, I have heard a mountain of stories over the Thanksgiving holiday of people who encountered friends or family members who were getting screenshotted things on WhatsApp of tweets that never happened, right? Like things that Biden said that he didn't say, things that, the president said that he didn't say, comments that came from Adam Schiff that are not things that Adam Schiff said. We just have to be really, really careful. And it's really important, like more now than ever, because the disinformation campaigns are going to be at an all-time high as we head into this procedure that we're going to be in very shortly with House Judiciary. All right, so let's start there. We had an announcement right before Thanksgiving that House Judiciary was going to have hearings this week related to the report coming out of House Intelligence on all the testimony that's been accumulated so far on Ukraine. This is a stage that we expected, as you all will remember. Articles of impeachment have to start in House Judiciary. They usually are voted on by House Judiciary before they go to the floor of the House for a vote by the full House. And so what's happening this week, these hearings that are being held are expected to be testimony from experts on the process of impeachment, and why impeachment matters, and what the historical basis is for impeachment, and all that other sort of stuff. It's going to be very academic stuff, and nonetheless very relevant. The big key here is that Nadler, as the chair of House Judiciary, did invite the White House to participate, and the White House declined. So one of the things that I want you all to remember when you're thinking about like the things you're encountering in the world or on social media about the defenses that the president may have, is that there are no legitimate defenses to what the president has done, right? Like you all remember in all the testimony that we saw in House Intelligence over the last month, that this is a cut and dried case. It's, it's locked down obvious, and there's no legitimate defense that has been offered on any legal or political basis to the crimes the president has committed. Now we're at a point where even the process defenses are falling apart. This claim of like, the president wasn't allowed to have a lawyer. The president wasn't allowed to call his own witnesses. The president wasn't allowed to have people in the room. This is all now, as I told you at the time, and is now all being revealed, like a load of horseshit. This is putting up a straw man argument to try to detract from the president's crimes. So the White House refusing to participate in legitimate hearings that are being held in front of House Judiciary when they've been invited to participate and have the president or his lawyers present is a sign of how weak their case is. And there's nothing about this, by the way, for those of you who've been following this broadcast for some time, that any of you should find shocking, right? It's quite obvious at this stage of the game that legally the president is in a world of hurt. And the only way that he is dealing with that is by running. Okay. So that brings me to one point that I do want to reiterate. He is headed to London for meetings related to NATO. He claimed this morning on the way out of DC that, the impeachment hearings in House Judiciary have been scheduled in this way. That's a load of bullshit. His lawyers are not going with him to NATO. His lawyers could be in the room making his case if they chose to, or participating in the hearings if they chose to. And they are opting not to do that. So again, the argument that, somehow Nadler scheduled this at a time where the president knew a year in advance that he had to be at NATO is also, once again, BS. So again, this particular set of developments is not at all surprising. And I will just add that, for someone with a narcissistic personality disorder like the president, the last thing they want is to participate in their own public humiliation. So running away right now from all of this, from his lawyers, from keeping his lawyers out of the process, keeping himself out of the process, not putting on any legitimate defense, is his way of avoiding the experience that he doesn't want to have. All right. So with all of that said, I want to just respond to a couple of the comments that those of you made about things that you had read on the internet or heard from other commentators and the like. And for those of you who weren't on when I started the broadcast, I started with this point of this is a moment to remember your sources, to be sure that the information that you are observing and internalizing is well sourced and comes from legitimate commentators. And if it does, to still remember that it's just one person's opinion. So somebody made a comment about why am I hearing from all of these commentators that the hearings didn't move the needle? Okay, so let me just say this. They actually did move the needle. And this is one of the reasons why you do have to be really careful about where you're getting your intel. The polling that came out of these particular hearings shows that we are now well over a majority of Americans who want the president removed. The polling as of this morning is at 53% for impeachment and removal. The numbers for just straight impeachment and supporting the impeachment process are much higher than that. They're in the 60s right now. So the idea that somehow this didn't move the needle, again, is bullshit. And it's a reason why, even on MSNBC, I'm going to say this, even on MSNBC, there are commentators who I really disagree with. There are more conservative members of the Democratic Party, more centrists, who are looking at this process. And I will remind you all, this is the first time that we've had an impeachment situation like this ever in our history. Nixon resigned under the threat of impeachment coming out of House Judiciary. We've never seen hearings like this, right? The situation that we had in the past with Andrew Jackson as our president is before any of us were born. And when it came to Bill Clinton, while we saw the process in action, it did not concern things like abuse of power, like corruption of this scale, like bribery and extortion, and the interference with the 2020 presidential election or any presidential election whatsoever. It's a scenario that none of us have ever seen. And so from the standpoint of where you are getting your information, it's really important to remember that opinions are just opinions, right? And polling is still just polling, because we've talked a lot on this broadcast about Andrew Johnson, not Andrew Jackson. The way in which polling is conducted in this country is not getting, in any event, to the totality of the American public. Many of you know this, that the way the polling is often conducted is by calling people at the dinner hour on a landline. How many of us have landlines anymore? How many of us are actually sitting down to dinner and are going to answer a phone when it rings? The way the polls are conducted these days, in many instances, are not keeping track of the times, and they're getting a skewed view. But I will just tell you this, that from the standpoint of how polling is conducted, if 53% of the people who still have a landline who answer it at dinner time are saying that the president should be impeached and removed, you can bet your bottom dollar that the numbers are a lot higher than that. So I'm not particularly concerned at this moment in time about any of it. And I will tell you that I think that going through House Judiciary, and you add that, by the way, to the insane defense of the president that we saw on the Sunday talk shows this weekend, the parroting of talking points directly from Putin, the calling out of the parroting of talking points directly from Putin by Chuck Todd, of all people, who you all know I'm not really a fan of, but he gave Kennedy a run for his money yesterday on Meet the Press. He didn't do it all the way, but he gave him a pretty solid run for his money. As Joy Reid, of all people, pointed out yesterday morning. All of that is raising the specter for a lot of, and I'm hearing from a lot of you that your traditional Republican parents, your grandparents, your Trumpy uncle, those people are looking at all of this and going damn, I'm not sure I want to be a part of this anymore. I'll just say this, like a lot of the older folks that I know who were still with the president up until now are people who remember having to hide under desks because of the threat of nuclear war from the Soviet Union. These are people who understand that Russia is an enemy. And if you look at this from the standpoint of the talking points that are being parroted by the Russians saying that Ukraine is to blame for the election, the only people who are still actually listening to all that stuff and not thinking to themselves, like, are the people who are so deep in the Trump cult and in the Fox News cult that there's no hope of rescuing them anyway. So from the standpoint of where we are, I think we're much further along the path to removal than we might otherwise believe. And I do happen to think that from the standpoint of where we find ourselves in terms of the general public, we are much further along the route to support of that process than we might otherwise believe. So again, be mindful of where you get your information. Be mindful of what you're repeating. And if it sounds to you like it's fatalistic when we saw what we saw, please assume that that's probably coming out of a Trump cult worldview. All right. We had a couple of other questions here about things like pardons and the like. So it is true that the pardon power extends not in cases of impeachment. What that usually means is that you can't pardon yourself if you are a president who is subject to impeachment. Robert Reich has made an argument that if the president goes through the process of impeachment and is actually impeached, he can't then be pardoned for his crimes. There are various legal scholars who have various opinions on this. I imagine that it's a viable argument. I agree with Robert Reich on some things, not all things, but most. I will just tell you that from the standpoint of where I sit, I think that's the least of our problems right now. I think the greater problem at this moment in time, is that if we want to leverage impeachment, we have to give the president a way out that is not about the pardon power, but is a way of saving the public humiliation that he is likely to face. Because I will tell you, he cares more about whether or not he's going to be publicly humiliated than he does about whether or not he's going to be pardoned. I think those two things go hand in hand. But, my argument on this front will be that, the exit route for the president has to be something that allows him to save face. And that's an argument that I've made from the very beginning. I know there are arguments to be made that this is why Nixon resigned. It's not the only reason why Nixon resigned. And Nixon was pardoned by Ford. That pardon, even in the legal framework of things, is a little bit questionable. But, we were at a moment in history where the country was prepared to move on. Ford wasn't even the vice president at the time of the impeachment proceedings and the investigation in Watergate happened. You all know this from listening to Rachel Maddow's podcast from last year. Fundamentally, from where we are right now, we have to really pay attention to what the leverage points for this president will be. And it's not just about criminal liability. It's not just about the pardon power. In fact, for this president, as we all know, because we've all been under him for the last 3 years, what it's really about is whether or not he's able to claim that he's the best at whatever it is. And there are exit routes, as we've discussed many times on this broadcast, that would give him the ability to still claim that. Trump TV is still an opportunity for him. That those leverage points have to be pushed, because it's not about the normal person's thing of like, I don't want to go to jail, right? It's way beyond that. And so while I appreciate Robert Reich's argument, it's not the only one out there that needs to be considered at this point in time. All right. A number of you asked about tapes of the phone calls, or a tape of the phone call. So I will just let you all know that over the holiday weekend, there was an issue that arose in the facts about whether or not the phone call that happened on July 25th actually even happened. There's an argument now being made that conversation actually might have happened in September, that the readout for this was fabricated, that part of the cover-up includes the idea that the July 25th call was not what it appeared to be. I will tell you that given that we've had testimony from participants on that call, I'm not going down the path of that particular theory. But what I will tell you is that the idea that these phone calls were quote unquote taped is not one that at the moment is supported by the evidence. And indeed, normally what happens when there's a readout of presidential phone calls is that there are note takers in the room. There are transcribers, like court reporters. Those are not necessarily audio tapes. Now, there was an indication because there was a tweet that was then deleted by I think it was by Senator Chris Murphy a couple of weeks ago that said there was a tape of the call. And what he meant to say instead was the readout or the transcript or, the summary, as this document has come to be called. The idea that there's a tape is something that we have yet to confirm. So, I just want to remind you all, by the way, that subpoenas have been issued for materials related to this. The White House has refused to comply with, that the White House has not responded to. And so, remember again that that's an indication of obstruction of justice. So in the event that there is a tape, that tape has already been subject to subpoena. Whether or not the White House turns it over, again, they have not complied with any subpoena. And that in and of itself may form another article of impeachment for obstruction of justice. So that's an answer to that. All right. One other thing here that I just want to mention with regard to ongoing investigations is that, we of course now have indications that that Rudy Giuliani's henchmen, and particularly Lev Parnas, are in very deep, we talked about this whole Devin Nunes thing last week, are in very deep at the moment with this conspiracy theory that Ukraine is responsible for interference in the 2016 election to try to get Hillary Clinton elected, blah, 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 Putin talking point. That's all you need to know about that. One of you asked a question about what's happened with all of the investigations that Robert Mueller farmed out. Well, one of the things that's happened is that Parnas and Fruman have been indicted. So, I want to remind you all that while ongoing investigations are happening with the Department of Justice, it is against DOJ policy for them to comment on those unless and until there is an indictment or some other public development, like an arrest, that relates to an ongoing investigation. So the fact that we have not heard about those dozen or so other referrals doesn't mean they're not happening. And by the way, there's every indication here that Parnas and Fruman and Giuliani are a part of that. So keep in mind, there's not going to be any sort of big breaking news about other investigations unless and until there's an indictment or an arrest. And that's not unusual. It doesn't mean anything's stopped. We have indications right now, by the way, that the Southern District of New York still has a fair amount of its own autonomy. That's great, because I know there's a lot of concern about Bill Barr having, co-opted the DOJ for his own aims and the aims of the president. Just know that at the bare minimum, we know that the DOJ is investigating Rudy Giuliani. We know that he's investigating Rudy Giuliani. It's investigating Rudy Giuliani for campaign finance fraud, amongst other crimes against the United States and otherwise. And that those investigations are continuing. And we don't have any reason to think at this moment in time, by the way, I will just add this, that the SDNY is not continuing with investigations that may have been farmed out to it from Robert Mueller. We just don't have public information because the DOJ doesn't let it out. All right, that's that. Lisa Page, who you all will remember gets blamed by the president relentlessly for, the all the kind of Steele dossier stuff and her affair with Peter Strzok and everything else, finally broke her silence last night in the Daily Beast. She was interviewed by Molly Jong-Fast right before Thanksgiving. I just want to encourage all of you to go read it. Not only because it's an incredible and difficult story by someone who has fundamentally been put in a position of blame and public humiliation by the president, but also because what to me is much more compelling about the story is her experience inside the DOJ and inside the mechanisms of national security, and watching how they're being undermined by this president. That information, by the way, the devolution of the DOJ in Washington, the fact that national security is suffering from its worst morale crisis, perhaps in our history, as a result of what Trump has done, is a story that needs to be told. And her experiences as a woman who's been targeted by Trump are absolutely relevant. There's no question that the misogyny of the way in which she's been treated is available for the world to see. But the story itself, to me, is incredibly compelling from the standpoint of what it means to watch the institutions. And this, by the way, is part of my experience, not even being inside of it. Watch the institutions that we have relied upon to uphold justice and democracy in this country being eradicated by this president and his criminal cabal. So I really encourage you all to go read that. I think it's really important that we do it. And I will just mention that, I expect that we will see quite a bit more from her. She now has a Twitter account that is legit, and that Molly Jong-Fast is linked to if you're interested in following Lisa Page. I think she's only getting started. So that story is a big part, by the way, of undermining the president's conspiracy theory that all of what happened in 2016 was designed to get Hillary Clinton elected. It's another one of those moments where I'm like, it's all crazy town over here. All right. So with all that said, we have a lot to get ready for this week in terms of what's happening in House Judiciary. I really want you all to kind of continue to leverage your senators, particularly if you have moderate senators in a red state. Again, targeting the Senate for a vote is the most important part now, because I'm just going to say it again because I know everybody needs to hear it. The articles of impeachment, as they are manifested, we haven't seen them yet, will pass House Judiciary. They will pass the House. So we are now in a position where what we really need to target, assuming that the president does not resign or isn't convinced to resign, is the folks who are going to be voting in the Senate. And we will have to kind of like push through that process, and our voices are going to be needed more than ever. And I'm honestly excited for the process that we're going to see in real time this week. Once again, it's kind of like history in the making. All right. Last thing I want to mention here is that we have a very big announcement coming up this week from the Gaia Project for Women's Leadership about what we're aiming to do in 2020. And I'm not going to announce it yet because we're not ready to rock. But I want to let you all know that we will be making an announcement about that in probably the next 2 days. And I encourage those of you who are really thinking about how you want to make 2020 a year where you find a way to make your biggest difference, to stay tuned for that, because we got some really good stuff coming up. All right, much love to all of you. I will talk to all of you tomorrow, regular time. Thanks for the being understanding about the delay and the glitch today. And I hope you all had a wonderful Thanksgiving, and I will see all of you live at regular time tomorrow. All right, thanks so much. Bye.